Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the presentation, Small Space Gardening for Pollinators. I am Elaine Mills. I am a volunteer with Virginia Cooperative Extension, the Arlington-Alexandria unit of Virginia Cooperative Extension. We, Master Gardeners, serve as volunteers sharing science-based information from our two Virginia land-grant colleges, Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. And we do this in a number of ways. Under normal circumstances, we have a functioning help desk at our headquarters in Fairlington, and you would be able to actually come to the office with any of your gardening questions. Right now, you can use the email address that's given on the screen, MG for Master Gardeners, ARL for Arlington, ALEX for Alexandria @gmail.com. Again, under normal circumstances, we have plant clinics at a variety of Arlington and Alexandria farmers markets and also at the Arlington Central Library. Those we hope will be functioning again before too long. We have a variety of demonstration gardens throughout Arlington and Alexandria that show best practices and a variety of plants for different circumstances: organic vegetable gardening, shade garden, sunny garden. And we also present a variety of classes. Normally those would be presented in person at a number of our public libraries, but right now you're welcome to sign up online. We have a number of great online classes coming up that have been organized by our Public Education Committee. Next week, there'll be Foraging for Wild Edibles. On the 22nd, Weed ID and Management. And I will be presenting again on June 5 with tips for climate conscious gardening. Virginia Cooperative Extension is supported by a nonprofit organization, Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia. And we support in a number of ways. One way is through our website, mgnv.org, and I'll be telling you a lot more about that at the end of the presentation. We also have a Facebook account and Instagram account. Those addresses are given there. And I've been creating a number of weekly posts about native plants. So check those out if you like in the future. I would like to thank our volunteer coordinator, Leslie Fillmore, for acting as the moderator. She'll be the one taking your questions. Elena Rodriguez is recording the presentation. I'd also like to thank my fellow Master Gardener, Tyler Ormsby, who helped send out the handouts to all those who registered. A recent presentation that I attended given by Doug Tallamy, the well-known entomologist and ecologist, included this quote: "In too many areas of our country, there is no place left for wildlife, but in the landscapes and gardens we ourselves create." So I'm hoping that through this presentation today, you can get some ideas of how you in your small gardens could be supporting wildlife, specifically our pollinators. So let's get started. Giving you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll describe what is pollination, answer the question, who are the pollinators? We'll talk about why those pollinators are important, what plants will provide the best support for pollinators in your gardens, what plant species are suitable specifically for small gardens and containers, and what are the best gardening practices to support those pollinators. Now, there are actually two types of pollination, abiotic and biotic. Abiotic pollination would be wind pollination. Some of our plants, like the grains and the grasses, are pollinated by wind. But for the purposes of our presentation, we'll be talking about pollination by insects. This involves the transfer of pollen from the anther, the male portion of a flower, to the stigma of a flower, usually a separate flower, that will be enabling fertilization, the formation of fruits and seeds, and the continuation of the cycle of reproduction. Now, adult insects will be coming to flowers. They're attracted to the flowers for the nectar for themselves. Nectar is the carbohydrate energy source for them. In the process of taking that nectar for themselves, they may also take pollen, which is a vital source of proteins and fats for some of their young. Their bodies may have the pollen stick, and when they move to a different flower, that pollen will be carried to a different plant. So, who are the pollinators? Well, bees are the best pollinators. As I've mentioned, they use both the nectar for themselves and pollen for their young. Now, we're not talking about honeybees. They are native to Europe, and even though they're used quite a bit in agriculture in this country, I'm going to be speaking about the 400 native species of bees in Maryland and Virginia. These come in a wide variety of sizes, and they have tongues of different lengths, which will determine which flowers they will make use of. Some of them are social, like bumblebees, but many of them are solitary, and most of them, 70% of them, nest underground. Solitary bees don't sting. A solitary female isn't going to want to waste her energy and her life in stinging you, because she wants to continue to remain around to protect her nest. Bees prefer white, yellow, or blue flowers, and they can be shallow, as shown with the cup flower, the yellow cup flower in the top picture, or they could be tubular, like the picture below. In the lower picture here, you can actually see the little pollinia, the little pockets, little baskets where bees can collect pollen to carry it. Flies are the second most efficient pollinators, and syrphid or flower flies are the most common of those. The adults feed on nectar and or pollen, and their young control aphids. They prefer flat or bowl-shaped white or yellow flowers. Wasps are important pollinators, but because they are not fuzzy like bees, they're less efficient. They'll visit the flowers for nectar, but they feed their young insects rather than pollen. They tend to prefer white or yellow flowers, despite the fact that this particular wasp was photographed on a lovely hibiscus. The poster children of the pollinators are certainly the Lepidoptera, as you see pictured here and on my t-shirt. Lepidoptera include the butterflies, skippers, and moths, and there are about 100 species that are native locally. Butterflies and their related species are not as efficient pollinators. They are really the primary pollinators of only about 8% of plants. And that's because their bodies don't really have a lot of contact with the flowers, although a little bit of pollen may stick to their wings. Butterflies prefer flat or composite flowers. Those are large flowers with a wide landing surface comprised of lots of smaller florets. And those would be preferred in bright colors, including red and purple. Moths are mostly nocturnal pollinators, prefer pale or night-scented tubular flowers. Beetles were actually the first pollinators, and they continue to be important for pollinating our ancient species such as magnolias and spicebush. They tend to be rather messy pollinators. They will actually chew through the flowers, sometimes even defecate in them and mate in them. They tend to prefer open white, cream, or green flowers, particularly with a fruity or a fetid fragrance. Now, hummingbirds aren't insects, but they can be pollinators, particularly of the bright colored tubular flowers, especially the red ones, and they'll feed on the nectar while hovering, and some pollen may land on their heads. There are other animals that can be pollinators, bats, for example, but we won't be discussing them today. The bats would tend to be pollinators in tropical areas. So why are pollinators important? Well, as Doug Tallamy says, insects are not optional. It's not okay if they disappear. They're the primary drivers of our ecosystems, and if they go, we go. They're important because close to 75%, 3 out of 4 flowering plants rely on pollinators to produce their seeds or fruit. Many agricultural crops, including those listed here, are insect pollinated. Now, before the advent of mass agriculture, particularly monocultures, large extents of single crops, our local bees could do a lot of the pollinating of crops and orchards. But because of the particular way agriculture is done now, that's why we've had to bring in the non-native honeybees. Insects also support reproduction of our garden plants, especially those that have separate male and female plants, the so-called dioecious plants. Insects also support other wildlife because the fruit that results as after pollination can be a large part of the diet of many animals. And 90% of our bird species actually consume the insects themselves, the caterpillars, during at least one stage of their lives. So there's a large role all of us as gardeners can play. And if we garden as if life depended on it, rather than just for beauty, the beauty of the flowers that we ourselves enjoy, we can do this in a couple of ways. First of all, we can plant nectar and pollen plants. Those would provide food for the adults and some of the young. But additionally, we need to plant the so-called larval host plants. These are the plants in which the foliage will feed the caterpillar stage of our Lepidoptera. And we actually want to see signs that our plants are being consumed. That ensures us that these pollinators, this particular generation of pollinators, is being supported. Doug Tallamy, in a joint study actually conducted here in the DC area by the University of Delaware and the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, determined that an ideal landscape will have 70% of its biomass consisting of native plants. Biomass would particularly be formed of woody plants, the trees and shrubs and vines. So he's indicated that native plants are the best support for pollinators. Why is that? Well, native plants are plants that have evolved over time without human intervention. Here in North America, this refers to flora that were present before Europeans arrived. And native plants are important for us because they are accepted. They've evolved with the local fauna, and the fauna will turn to them as food sources and for shelter. Native plants are good for us because they're best adapted to our local climate conditions. And we're lucky because native plants have great ornamental qualities, as well as providing those ecosystem services. And as our Arlington County naturalist, Alonso Abugadas, informs us, we have many locally native plants to choose from. So which native plants would be appropriate for small gardens? Well, as I mentioned, in order to get that biomass, it would be a good idea to have a fair proportion of woody plants. But for a small garden, the canopy layer trees at 40 to 100 feet are going to be too tall. So our presentation today will focus on understory trees, some shrubs, vines, and a variety of perennials. Before we get into the specifics of the plants I'm recommending, I agreed that we would stop for a few moments and see if there are any questions. Leslie?
Yep. So Elaine, somebody just said, what is small in this context?
I guess I'm thinking of gardens, particularly those maybe behind a townhouse where there's a more limited area. And I'll also be talking for folks who maybe just have a patio area, a deck, or maybe even just a balcony. That's what we'll be describing.
Okay, and then of course we had our usual question if the slides will be available, and I did explain that you've put together some wonderful resources that folks should have gotten prior to this meeting, and as well that this video is being recorded and the recording will be available on mgnv.org in about approximately 1 week. So, all right, let's continue, Elaine.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Speaking of those handouts, the first section of the handouts includes a list of plants. I was thinking that this would be very handy for all of you to be able to follow along. You can take notes on plants that are of interest to you, flag ones that you might want to include in your own garden. You'll notice if you have those handouts in front of you that I give both the common names and the scientific names in Latin. The reason I do that is many of our native plant nurseries will actually sell plants under the scientific name. So moving along, let's take a look at those specific plants. We'll begin with some small native understory trees. A very nice tree is American hornbeam, Carpinus caroliniana. It has a rounded crown and a really interesting, almost muscular fluting to the trunk. It's an excellent tree for urban sites because it's resistant to disease. And it's both a larval and a nectar source. You'll see the butterflies that are supported, the tiger swallowtail, striped hairstreak, and red spotted purple. And the catkins in the spring and the nutlets of this tree in the fall also will provide support for our bird species. Another lovely tree is our Virginia state tree, the flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. It's a slightly shorter tree. Certainly has multi-season interest. It will provide nectar and pollen for our very early pollinators and is the larval host for the spring azure butterfly. And of course, we're all familiar with the lovely fall color of the foliage and the rich fruit that provides support for birds. A wonderful pollinator support plant is downy serviceberry. Amelanchier arborea, a slightly shorter plant, usually comes in a multi-stem form. Again, it has all-season beauty with these lovely white flowers in the spring, and then this fruit in the summer that can be enjoyed by a wide variety of bird species and all of us as well. It attracts many native species, and it's the larval host for quite a few species of butterflies and moths, including the tiger swallowtail. Another lovely spring plant, a harbinger of spring, is eastern redbud. And if you have a smaller garden, you might consider this cultivar Little Woody. It's a nectar source for early season butterflies and particularly for long-tongued bees that can reach into these tiny flowers. The straight species of river birch is really quite tall, but Little King cultivar is a more manageable size for those smaller gardens. It has a similar form, these attractive multiple trunks and the beautiful exfoliating bark that's so characteristic of this plant. Doug Tallamy considers this a keystone species. That means that it provides great support to a wide variety of pollinators. It's the larval host for several butterfly and moth species, And the morning cloak and northern purlei actually use the sap as well. This tree is not a pollinator tree, but for those of you who are looking for a smaller size evergreen plant to use as a screen plant, this could, arborvitae can be a nice plant providing a food source and nesting for birds. Now we can look at some small native shrubs. One of my favorites is black chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa. It's about 3 to 6 feet high and wide. It has multiple stems to it, and it can spread. You can control the spread if you like with the offshoots. It has lovely spring flowers that have just finished back in April, and glossy green leaves. The foliage will turn an attractive color in the fall. I'm beginning to see signs of the fruit. It's still very green at this point, but it will turn this color when it's ripe and be attractive for our birds. And it provides nectar for small bees and is the larval host for the coral hairstreak butterfly. Another attractive small shrub is dwarf fothergilla. It has very showy flowers that have a bottle brush form. They've just finished here in April. Great fall color and great nectar for our bees. For those of you who are interested in an evergreen plant, Ilex glabra, inkberry, is a native holly. I'm particularly recommending the shamrock cultivar, which is a manageable size for small gardens. This could be an attractive alternative to boxwood, which we've recently found in our area can be prone to the boxwood blight. It has very small, fairly inconspicuous white flowers. We wouldn't especially notice them, but they're very attractive to our pollinators. And then in the fall, there'll be fruit for the birds. Another lovely native shrub is sweet pepper bush. It comes in a variety of forms. This is the straight species pictured here. There's another lovely pink flowered cultivar called Ruby Spice, but I'm mentioning here the hummingbird cultivar, which is considerably shorter at 2 to 3 feet high and wide. It has fragrant flowers, whether they're white or pink, from July to August, and as you can see, they're very attractive to hummingbirds. And this plant has really interesting seed heads that will linger on well into spring and provide seed for our birds. Another shorter cultivar is the Little Henry cultivar of Virginia sweetspire at about 2 to 3 feet. It will be having spring flowers coming up in May and June. I can see the beginning of the flower spires in my garden now. And it has a gorgeous flaming fall color that will rival the invasive burning bush. It will provide nectar for various pollinators. And the shortest of the shrubs I'm mentioning today is lowbush blueberry. So short, you could actually use it as an edging plant or a ground cover. It will have spring flowers, and then that will produce summer fruit. The best means to get that fruit is to choose plants from several sources so that there'll be the best chance of cross-pollination. And this plant provides nectar and pollen for bumblebees. We'll take a look at continuing with our woody plants at a number of native vines. Carolina jessamine is one of the very first of our vines to bloom. It can be blooming as early as February. And all of the vines that I'll be mentioning are really a great selection for a small garden when you're going vertical. This plant has fragrant, long-lasting flowers, and they're very attractive to bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. American wisteria, Wisteria frutescens, is a great alternative to the invasive Asian wisterias, the Chinese and Japanese wisterias that can move into our wildlife areas and smother even full-fledged trees. This plant is attractive because it can start blooming when it's fairly young. It will have fragrant flowers in May. I'm seeing the buds on my plant already, and it attracts butterflies and hummingbirds. Trumpet honeysuckle doesn't have the appealing fragrance of Japanese honeysuckle, but it is a great substitute for that invasive species. It has a number of attractive features. For one, it's semi-evergreen. It has a long bloom period. Mine this year began blooming in March, and in other years I've had it bloom as late as December. The buds are actually turning to flowers now in my garden. This is a vine growing on one of my arbors. It's looking pretty much like this right now, and then it will be blooming intermittently into the fall. And it will attract both hummingbirds, butterflies, and bees. It's the larval host for these different butterflies and moths. And it also produces this fleshy fruit, which is great food for our birds. Another nice native vine is Virgensbauer. It's the native clematis, and it's a great substitute for the invasive sweet autumn clematis. It has showy, fragrant flowers that will be coming along in August, and it attracts hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. I mentioned that grasses and sedges are wind pollinated, but these plants can provide other sources of support for our pollinators.
Elaine, we have a couple questions. Can we take a break? Couple questions?
Okay.
Elaine, are
I
you
thought
ready?
we were going to Leslie?
Yes.
I thought we were going to stop right after this before I got to the perennials.
Okay, go for it.
Yes, there's just a few plants that I'll be for a couple of slides right here.
Okay.
So if you want to plant in the shade, you might choose bottlebrush grass. It's about a 3 to 4 foot tall plant that has these really striking bottlebrush flowers, and the leaves will provide nourishment for the northern pearly-eyed butterfly. Pennsylvania sedge is a short sedge, maybe about 6 to 12 inches tall. As I said, it's wind pollinated, but its foliage will provide a hosting for 36 species of skippers and satyrs. And it's a great choice of plant for dry shade, where it could actually be kind of a lawn substitute. And if you want to plant some of these species in the sun, a lovely choice is pink muley grass. Has these stunning flowers that catch the sunlight, looking almost like children's sparklers or fireworks. This plant attracts lady beetles and provides perching places for migrating butterflies. And another lovely grass is little blue stem. It starts out with these blue-green leaves and then turns lovely colors. This picture was actually taken in my garden in December with the seed heads. It hosts a number of skippers, and it also provides nesting for bumblebee queens. Okay, Leslie, let's take any questions before we move on to our native perennials.
Okay, so earlier on, apparently you had said that an ideal landscape is about 70% native, or and somebody had asked the question of why wouldn't you strive for 100% native?
Well, Doug, striving for 100% would be a fabulous thing. Doug Tallamy is as the one who came up with that formula, feels that it's more realistic to acknowledge the fact that many gardeners find non-native plants. Those are benign, the ones that are benign, not invasive. Find them attractive. And he feels that it's realistic to assume that they may want to include some of those plants in their gardens. It was found that 70% just happened to be create that particular balance that allowed enough, he was looking particularly at Lepidoptera, allowed enough caterpillars to find sources of food, and then they in turn would provide food for the bird species that rely so heavily on caterpillars for feeding their young.
Okay. So could you tell us a little bit more about the use of cultivars versus straight species?
I'm going to be covering that very specifically when we get to our best practices. So I'd like to hold that question for then. I think if there's further need for explanation, people can pose their questions again, but I'll be going into detail on that.
Terrific. Okay, somebody had asked that you say a little bit more about choosing plants from multiple sources for the low bush blueberry.
Yes, you either, if you're going to one nursery, could ask if they have plants that they in turn have acquired from different suppliers. Or if it looks like one of the nurseries only has plants from one source, you could get plants from a number of different native plant sources.
And that's in order to ensure fruit set?
Yes. A number of plants really do the best when they have plants from different sources. That just allows more genetic variation.
Okay. Somebody had asked which vine would give the most shade?
Let's see. Well, I guess maybe the ones that are growing the tallest, we can move back. This one, for example, the Carolina jessamine is growing quite tall, 3 to 6 feet wide. This particular wisteria, I don't think grows quite as extensively as the non-native ones. Trumpet honeysuckle, I've got quite a bit of shade under that. It's not really, because I've limited it to this one little arbor, it's not reaching extensively, but it does shade the plants.
Excuse me, I think the question is, can it grow in the shade, not provide shade?
Okay, I see. Oh, okay. Well, all of them grow, the ones I've listed here grow in sun to part shade. So I think they need they probably are going to flower and fruit the best if they have a certain amount of sun. That some of the grasses and sedges I mentioned can actually be grown, like the this one, the bottlebrush grass, can actually grow in fairly dense shade, but the vines, I think, do better, at least with some degree of sun.
Okay, and our final question was somebody asking about a plant called passion flower maypops. They were under the impression that it was a native vine that was good for local pollinators, but now they have heard that it's a very aggressive grower. Have you heard of that particular?
Yes. The reason I didn't include it was because of that. It is in fact a native plant, and it does provide support. But one of our master gardeners, a friend of mine, a colleague, when I went to see where she had planted it in a public school setting, she told me that she was really having trouble keeping it under control. I know some people enjoy it very much, and if you feel like you want to put in the effort to keep it from spreading, you could do that. I guess you could just make sure that the fruit, the so-called maypops, aren't going to be exploding and spreading the seed. But it also grows just with the spreading vining tendency.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Let's continue on.
Okay. We're going to be looking at native perennials now. And I just wanted to mention, I've grown most of the plants that I'm talking about either in my own garden or in one of the Master Gardener demonstration gardens that I help coordinate. So you can consider these our so-called tried and true plants. I'm going to present these in pretty much in bloom sequence, starting with early spring. So Spring Beauty, Virginia Bluebells, and Wild Geranium are good choices for that, for the very early spring. Spring Beauty and Virginia Bluebells are so-called ephemeral plants. They're the plants that are going to come out very early in a natural setting in the understory of a forest before the canopy begins leafing out. And then as the canopy forms and the light is blocked, they will actually die back, but they are perennials. So even though you won't be seeing signs of either their flowers or their foliage, I still have a few Spring Beauty blooming now. My bluebells have completely finished flowering and the leaves are pretty much disintegrating. But both of those are perennials and they will come back again next year. Spring Beauty is a great example of plants that have nectar guides on their flowers that help guide the pollinators to the center of the bloom. Wild Geranium has just finished blooming in my garden, but the foliage will linger on. And all of these plants will support our bees with nectar as they begin to emerge, the native bees as they emerge from hibernation. Some more spring flowers for bees are golden ragwort and beard tongue. Both of these have a rosette of leaves and then a tall stalk, maybe about 18 inches high. The golden ragwort has just finished blooming in my garden, and beard tongue is yet to come. It hasn't really sent up its flower stalks yet. So both of these are really attractive. The golden ragwort has a kind of a daisy-like flower. The penstemon has a more tubular flower. Golden ragwort is a great nectar plant, and I'd like to mention that our local Audubon at Home program recommends it highly as an excellent replacement for English ivy. Once you've removed the dying flower stalks, once you've cut those back, the foliage, the hardy foliage remains, and it can spread nicely in a wide variety of conditions, from sun to shade, from medium to moist conditions. And it can be a great control for erosion and replace that invasive English ivy. Beard tongue, again, once the flower stalks are cut down, it has an attractive foliage, and both of them, it's pretty much semi-evergreen foliage that will last on into the winter. Beard tongue is a great heavy producer of nectar, and it's also a host plant. More spring flowers for butterflies. I was reminded of this, and in fact, you won't see this listed on the plant list. My colleague, Alyssa Ford Morell, in her presentation last week on gardening for butterflies, reminded people that although many folks consider violets kind of a weedy plant, they are in fact native. There are many varieties beside the two that I pictured here, the striped and the common blue or Confederate violet. But I consider this kind of a freebie. I haven't had to go out and purchase these plants. They just will spring up, and I can use them as a ground cover even after they've finished flowering. The important reason for maybe considering inclusion of these would be that they are the primary host plant for fritillaries. Moving on into summer flowers for pollinators. Here's three in the purple to pink range. Blazing star, there are many types of blazing star, but this one has the showiest tall flower spikes. And anise hyssop also has those flower spikes. Those are great for many types of pollinators, and they are locally native. Purple coneflower, Echinacea, is not actually literally locally native. It's more native to the Midwest, but it does so well here that we consider it a great example of a tried and true plant. And these provide nectar, all of them, for a wide variety of our pollinators. More summer to fall flowers. Monarda is in the mint family. It has nectar for long-tongued bees and as you can see, butterflies here, as well as hummingbirds, and it's a host for moths. Great blue lobelia has tubular flowers that are great for bumblebees, and the long-tongued swallowtail butterflies can get the nectar from those as well. In the red flowered range, we have another Monarda in the mint family, Monarda didyma, scarlet bee balm, and another lobelia, cardinal flower. Lobelia can grow in kind of woodland areas, moister woodland areas. This scarlet bee balm tends to grow more in sunnier areas. And we also have a lovely native hibiscus, Hibiscus coccineus, that is a great pollinator plant. In the yellow flowering range, these are flowers that will actually extend into the fall. We have woodland sunflower. This tends to grow at woodland edges. It provides lots of nectar and pollen for a wide variety of pollinators, and it's also a larval host. Orange coneflower is one of a number of Rudbeckia species, and it's both a nectar and a host plant. And I want to particularly single out goldenrod species, the Solidago species. Doug Tellamy lists this as the top herbaceous plant genus for pollinators. It supports 115 species. Goldenrods come in many shapes and sizes. I grow the fireworks cultivar of Solidago rugosa, and I also particularly like Solidago caesia, C-A-E-S-I-A. It's a shorter plant with delicate little yellow flowers. It's important to continue providing flowers for our pollinators well into the fall. And a couple of examples with white flowers are these. There are two native heucheras, Heuchera americana and Heuchera villosa. The autumn bride cultivar of villosa has really stunning, very large flowers. They will provide nectar to butterflies and hummingbirds. White wood aster is both a nectar and a host plant, again, a fall plant. And both of those can be very attractive as ground covers, even once the flowers have faded. The heucheras, the foliage will be a little bit shorter. The white wood aster is about 18 inches tall. This is growing in my garden, as you can see, in kind of semi-shade conditions. Actually, both of them do well in those semi-shade conditions. And helping carry support for pollinators late into the fall, mountain mint. I'm mentioning this particular one, Pycnanthema muticum, but there are several other locally native species. This particular one was selected in the Penn State Extension plant trials a number of years ago as both the best plant for pollinator diversity, the variety of pollinators, and for sheer numbers of pollinators that came. I think it was maybe numbering in the 70s within just a several minute period in their plant trials. It is a mint and will spread, but it's easy enough to pull it up and control it if you want to limit the area that it spreads in. And Doug Tellamy ranks all of the asters as number 2 for providing support. Aromatic aster is a little bit shorter. And I want to mention that a nice way to control some of those taller spreading plants like the asters and the Joe Pies is to actually pinch those plants back. You can do it several times during the growing season. I've already pinched back some of my asters, You can do it up until about July. That will allow the plants to branch out and spread, actually producing more flowers. And that way they won't flop, and they'll just be under better control for smaller garden conditions. Now, a number of people might be specifically interested in plants to support the monarchs. There are three, I guess there are actually more, but I'm familiar with three locally native species: common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly weed. I personally consider the Asclepias syriaca just too aggressive for a small garden situation, even though it is highly preferred by the caterpillars. But you could turn, if you have slightly moister conditions, to swamp milkweed, which has these lovely, slightly flatter pink flowers, or the more diminutive butterfly weed. It's maybe about 18 inches tall with these orange flowers. So these serve as nectar plants for the adult monarchs, and then their foliage, as you can see pictured here, is enjoyed by the caterpillar stage of the butterflies. Now, host plants for our lovely swallowtails are in the parsley or carrot family, and you may be already growing some of these if you're growing herbs like fennel, parsley, or carrot. You can see here the early instars of some of those caterpillars and moving into a slightly later stage. Another lovely native plant that's in the parsley family is Golden Alexanders. This grows both in sunny conditions and in semi-shade conditions. This was pictured in my garden, and it's blooming. It's in pretty much full bloom right now. Let's see. I guess we agreed that we were going to stop. I'm not sure what happened. I thought I had included a slide on a couple of plants that it's a good idea not to plant, good plants to avoid. And I'll mention those before we take questions, Leslie. Those two plants are one of the Asclepias plants, one of the milkweed plants, Asclepias corysavica. It's tropical milkweed. It has multicolored flowers in brighter colors. The reason I would recommend not planting that particular milkweed is that it's actually native to South America, and it does grow also natively in some of our southern states. It's been stated that it's not a good idea to plant that for several reasons. One is the monarchs who are migrating tend to count on that plant toward the southern part of their migration as they're moving down to Mexico. And for them to see that plant here is going to confuse their migratory patterns. The other reason is that when that plant is grown as a perennial, apparently it hosts a kind of a parasite that can be detrimental to the monarchs. So it's really best to stick with our locally native species. The other plant that many people think of as the quintessential butterfly plant is a butterfly bush. This is not a good plant to plant for several reasons. Number one, it's not a native plant. It is native to Asia. Number two, it actually is an invasive plant. It can escape from garden conditions and move into our natural areas. Now, some people think, well, if I have a so-called sterile cultivar, that will solve the problem. It won't be invasive. But it's been shown that some of those so-called sterile cultivars can actually revert back to a fertile state. And both Arlington and Alexandria list butterfly bush as invasive. It's on their invasive plant lists, and they ask people not to plant that. The other reason is that although it does in fact provide nectar to our butterflies, it's totally ignoring the full life cycle of those butterflies, and it is not a plant that the females would be able to use for depositing their eggs. So please don't plant those two. Okay, we can take some more questions here.
All right. Somebody asked, how do you feel about dandelions? They used to pull them out of their yard, but now they're concerned that they're, you know, taking food from insects. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's true. They could be a source. I actually don't have any turf grass in my garden, so I don't tend to get dandelions. So I don't have a lot of experience with them. But I find that they just spread so much that I personally prefer not to include those. But if someone chooses to do that in a lawn, then that's that person's choice, and it could be acceptable.
You had a question about for ragwort and beard tongue. Why do you cut back the flower heads after flowering?
Okay, with the golden ragwort, the flowers start looking kind of bedraggled after a while, and little white seed heads will form fairly quickly. If you are just starting out with a few of the plants and you would like to encourage them to spread via seed, you actually could leave the flower heads up and allow those little seed heads to be carried by the wind and to spread. If, on the other hand, you already have a substantial patch and you know that it's spreading via its runners underground, then you could just cut that back to control the spread. The penstemon actually looks rather attractive once it's gone, once the flowers have died back, and it has a pretty attractive seed head. So you could keep that seed head going. Again, if you don't want it to spread, you would just cut that back. I've actually allowed mine to spread in past years, and now I can use that plant. I can propagate it and spread it to multiple areas of my garden and get a lot of free babies from the plant just because I have allowed it to spread in the past. So it's just a gardener's choice.
Gotcha. All right. How much do you pinch back the asters each time you're pinching those back?
Sometimes I'll just pinch out the central leaves, the ones that are kind of curled up, and the growing tips. And other times I will actually cut those back by maybe 6 inches or so. I'll cut back. You can cut them back even to maybe about a third, by a third. Tracy Sabato Angst has a great book on care of care of perennials, and that would be that's a great reference book for exactly how to go about that process. As I said, I just began pinching my asters back. I think I took them down took the growing tip down to the next leaves, maybe about 6 inches or so. And if they're continuing to grow and I want to control that height a little bit more, I'll maybe do it again at least one more time before July. The fireworks goldenrod that I mentioned that would normally be maybe 4 feet tall, I can maintain at about an 18-inch height as a beautiful surround for shrubs by doing that pinching back technique. And that's a handy one if you want to control the height in a smaller garden.
Okay. So somebody has seed for butterfly weed, and they said the instructions said to stratify the seeds. They want to know what is that and what happens if they skip that step.
Okay, I don't know all the particulars of stratification, but different seeds flower best when they actually go through different kinds of processes, whether it be drying or sometimes the seeds need to be held in cold conditions. So I think you would need to look up the specifics for stratification for each of those types of seeds. I know that the Lady Bird Johnson wildflower website includes some information on exactly how seeds are prepared, but those are for native species. And as I mentioned, was this for butterfly weed or butterfly bush?
Butterfly weed, yeah.
Butterfly weed. Okay, it might be good to look at that source and see if they describe exactly how that works.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations on native plants that don't self-seed so that they don't spread to like neighbors' yards and such things as townhouses?
Let's see. I guess plants like the golden ragwort that have the windborne, those windborne little seed heads are maybe examples of plants that are going to spread a little bit more. I think pretty much any of the ones that I mentioned are not going to spread in troublesome ways.
Okay. And I'm going to jump you back for a second here. We had two questions. One was about vines. Is there a particular vine that you would recommend for growing around like deck railings?
I think any of them can really. I've seen a number of them grown on pergolas. They can be grown on pergolas and fences and arbors. So I think any of them should be okay. I know as I said, I grow the native honeysuckle on an arbor. I've seen the native wisteria on pergolas. So I would think that would work on a deck. Okay.
All right. And one about the grasses. They wanted to know if all the grasses self-seeded.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The grasses. Let's see, the bottle brush grass, I've actually had it spread by seed and little babies spread around, but it's very easy to take up if you want to control the spread. It's really very attractive actually when you tend to have a small area dedicated to that plant kind of as a backdrop. The little blue stem will enlarge. It's a clumping grass, so it will enlarge and the base will get larger over time. But it's not going to be spreading. I haven't seen it in my garden spreading prolifically. I've actually had discrete clumps of it if I wanted to have it spread over a certain area. The Pennsylvania sedge is an example of one that actually spreads by runners. So that will move just that in that particular way, but not by seeding so much, but just by the underground spreading.
Okay. And we did have one question to find out if you're going to be talking about container gardening, and I know you do cover that. So
yes,
we'll save that question for later.
Yes, we're going to be that. I've dedicated a whole section to container gardening.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. Just right before we do that, I want to talk about a few best gardening practices for pollinators in general for the gardens. First, it's a good idea to purchase locally grown native plants. Those are the particular ecotypes that will do well in your garden here. You want to purchase from a reputable nursery that doesn't use the systemic insecticides, the so-called neonics that people have been hearing about. Those contain a systemic herbicide, and that they're going to control not just the insect pests, but our pollinators as well. And it's really a good idea to eliminate pesticide and herbal use in the garden. And this includes sprays for mosquitoes. If you're concerned about control of mosquitoes, please go to the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website. Our Master Gardeners have been creating a whole series of articles about how to deal with mosquitoes, and there are ways to control them more safely. In this country, we've gotten so used to the idea that we want to essentially wage war on insects. We tend to think of insects as pests, but we forget that all of the insects are affected. I know I was really affected when I saw on Instagram a picture of a bumblebee, a dead bumblebee with her tongue extended, and she had been nectaring on one of these systemically treated plants, or a plant that was sprayed, and she died as a result of that. Oh, I guess I had these out of order. So this is just going back to the milkweed and the butterfly bush. Continuing with best practices, you may want to plant. Pollinators are particularly attracted to sunny areas. I have mentioned those plants that are good for shade as well, but they tend to like the sunny areas. You'll want to provide as much as you can plants that are going to offer continuous bloom from spring through fall. And I've actually heard it said that if you can possibly have 3 different plant species blooming simultaneously, that's a good idea. You want to try to plant a variety of colors and flower types. As I've mentioned, the different pollinators are attracted to different colors, and they can feed more easily on different types. It's a good idea to plant as much as possible within the bounds of your small garden. Groups of plants, masses of them, rather than spacing them out within the garden. Try to plant a cluster of them, at least 3, 5 plants. This is for 2 reasons. Number one, the pollinators who will want to come to those plants can spot them more easily if they see a larger mass of those plants of that color. Secondly, you're going to be helping those pollinators feed more efficiently. If they don't have to be flying from one plant to another, but can stay pretty much in one area, they can conserve energy. And this is particularly true of those large flowering plants like the Joe Pies that are pictured here, the milkweeds, which had multiple florets. They can land and can feed individually on all the little tiny florets, and they can be very efficient that way. And as I mentioned before, you want to include the larval host plants in your landscape as well. Just a quick review of the colors that are preferred: white, yellow, and blue preferred by bees. This is the penstemon, and this is blue lobelia. And this is one I hadn't mentioned, oxeye. It's a type of sunflower, really attractive summer and fall blooming plant that has a shallower flower. The pink, purple, red, orange, and yellow plants are very attractive to our butterflies. This is swamp milkweed, New York ironweed, cardinal flower, the short butterfly weed, and again the oxeye. And then if you want to attract hummingbirds, red or orange. A question came up earlier about cultivars, so let me address that here. You want to choose your cultivars carefully. Cultivars are plants that have been chosen by our native plant nurseries for particular characteristics that they think will be appealing to gardeners. If you are choosing cultivars for height, that could be acceptable, and I mentioned that as a solution for some of the getting a cultivar of some of the taller trees and shrubs. Where you want to be careful is when the cultivars affect the flowers and the leaf color. So let's talk about that. If leaves are changed from, this is arrowwood viburnum, the native straight species. If you go from that to the red feather cultivar, which has a red or a kind of a purplish foliage, you're actually changing the chemistry. Rather than having so much chlorophyll, you actually have anthocyanins. And the anthocyanins actually discourage feeding. So this plant can no longer serve as a host plant. As far as flowers go, here's an example. This is what the straight species of wild hydrangea arborescens, looks like. This lovely Annabelle cultivar is beautiful, but it is beautiful because most of the flowers are sterile. So it's not going to provide anywhere near, you can see all the possible nectar that our pollinators can get out of the straight species. Purple coneflower is another great example. There are so many cultivars of that plant. The straight species has this very prominent cone with nectaries in the center of the plant. The minute you go to the really fancy plants, flowers like Double Delight, the nectaries are reduced almost to nothing. So this plant can't serve as a nectar plant. Some more good gardening practices for our butterflies. A good idea to provide basking and puddling sites and shallow water sources. You'll want to change that water every few days so that you don't encourage the breeding of mosquitoes. And you'll also want to see if you can provide nesting places for native bees. As I mentioned earlier, most of our native bees are ground nesting bees. Some examples are mining bees, sweat bees, and cellophane bees. And a way you can do that is by leaving a small patch of bare soil in a sunny, well-drained location. If you don't want to actually have a area that's so obvious, I've heard it said that you can just leave some bare soil in the back of a garden bed. In other words, don't cover it with mulch, and that will allow them to create their little nests. 30% of bees, including bumblebees, mason bees, and carpenter bees, are cavity nesting bees. A lot of people think that they might want to have a little bee hotel. In one of the talks that was jointly given by Sam Droege and Alonza Abugadas, two master gardeners, they were indicating that these kinds of locations can be problematic. For one, if all of the larvae are concentrated in one location, predator species will find it easier to ransack this little hotel. For another, it's not just a case of putting this out. These have to be cleaned out annually, and that could be kind of a difficult process. So you might want to think twice about it. I don't use this, but please read carefully if you would like to consider it and see how to do it properly. Something that you can do more easily is if you have plants with somewhat larger stems, pencil size or larger, you can actually leave some of these stems up over the winter, and that will allow the bees to actually lay their larvae in the stems. You'll want to retain those plant stalks and fallen leaves as well for overwintering insects. In one of his recent talks, Doug Tellamy talked about how the caterpillars of certain Lepidoptera could be formed on a native tree. Then, if they fall to the ground in the leaves, and then the leaf litter is swept up, sucked up, carted away, you're essentially doing away with that whole generation of that species. So what I do is I actually leave some of the stems of my larger plants up. They can be really architecturally attractive with just the seed heads themselves and with ice and snow on them in the winter. If you don't want to keep them in place, you could do what we do at the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. We actually take a tomato cage and place some of those stems in the cage and allow those to stay in our little pollinator garden over the winter. And you'll want to also delay spring cleanup. Wait until the temperatures are getting a little bit warmer in the 50s and 60s before you clean up. Then all of the insects that would have been in the stems or the leaves will have a chance to emerge. So now, for those of you who have been waiting for the section on container gardening, we're going to address that here. There's some benefits for container gardening. If you have limited spaces, you can do it in window boxes. You can have pots in doorways, on steps. You can make use of decks, patios, balconies, and rooftops, and your pollinators can even fly to those locations. You can grow plants with different soil requirements from the soil in the garden, and pots will give you some portability, so you can move them to different situations. You can protect them more in the winter. And if in fact you need to move to a new home, you can transfer the plants along with you. So there's some special considerations when you're working with native plants. For one thing, you're going to be using perennials rather than the traditional summer blooming annuals. Native plants, some of them will bloom for a period of weeks or even a month or so, but they're not going to bloom all summer long the way the annuals do. So you're going to be relying more on the color and the texture of the foliage for visual interest in the containers that you plant. You'll want to match the plants carefully to the growing conditions. So if you have a sunny balcony, let's say, you're not going to be able to do those shade-loving plants. Some of the articles that I've looked at in preparation for this presentation, one of them was from Mount Cuba, which is a garden that particularly focuses on native plants, and in the garden features lots of plants in containers. And their recommendation is to start with good-sized nursery pots rather than, let's say, plugs, so that you can get established fairly quickly and get adequate growth. And again, you may want to use the compact cultivars when it's appropriate in a container, but please retain the flower color, shape, and the foliage color, as I discussed earlier, to give the best support either for nectar or as a host plant from the straight species. So there's lots of different kinds of containers that you can look at. They come in a wide variety of materials. So you'll just need to do a little research and decide which one is best for your conditions, which one will maybe retain moisture a little bit longer, which one will be better going into the fall and winter conditions, which one might be a little easier to move around. Dark containers, of course, will absorb sunlight more, so they'll hold the heat, and you have to decide whether that's a good or a bad thing. When you consider shape, I've read that square containers will actually give you about 50% more space than round containers, and containers with a wider opening will be better. It won't confine the plants so much as those that are wide but then narrow down at the opening. You'll have to consider the size. Larger containers obviously can have more plants, but if they are beginning to get heavy and are hard to move around, that could be an issue. The most important consideration is that you have good drainage. And a lot of people think that putting pot shards in the bottom of their pots is a great idea. Please go to our website and read about some of our myth busting articles, and you'll learn about why that's not such a great idea. So what kind of soil? Well, you're not going to want to use soil right out of your garden. Please use organic potting mix. but it's not a good idea to add those additives that are supposed to help retain moisture. That can actually hold too much moisture the way a soggy diaper would, and just create the wrong growing conditions. Now, some people advocate using inert bulk material like empty water bottles in the bottom of a very large pot, so you don't have to put so much soil in. You definitely don't want to use styrofoam because roots could grow through that, and that would really be a problem. If you have a very large pot where you've used those lighter weight materials in the bottom, there could be some concern about them tipping over. So you just need to decide what your conditions are going to be. You can always put compost or mulch in the bottom. Those are lighter weight materials, and you won't be using the more expensive potting soil. And you can add compost for nutrients and to keep that soil biology going, but the native plants don't really need to have fertilizers. So what type of plants? Well, perennials that we've been mentioning, ferns, grasses and sedges and rushes, and even some small shrubs. If you have sunny conditions, you'll want to choose plants that are native to the prairies and open fields. And for shade, you'll want to grow woodland natives that are going to grow in more dappled conditions. You'll obviously want to group plants if you have more than one that have the same cultural requirements. And again, please purchase from a reputable nursery that doesn't use systemic insecticides. So we can look at some design principles. You can have standalone pots for trees or shrubs, and also for vines. If you have a particularly striking plant like a yucca or a fern, just a single species could look really attractive. Standalone pots could also help you control, for example, you wouldn't want to get really close to an eastern prickly pear, Opuntia humifusa, but having it in a pot can allow you to move it around and handle it safely. River oats and scarlet bee balm can spread, and if you want to enjoy them but have them in a more limited area, then you could put those in a container. You can have a repetition of containers of the same plant, or group different herbaceous plants and different shrubs in attractive massings. One idea might be to come up with a theme. This is just one example, and you'll see this on your handout. There's details specifically on this. You can include all the plants that you think might be attractive for hummingbirds. You could have trumpet honeysuckle on a little fence like this, eastern columbine, which has these lovely red and yellow flowers, the native lilies like Canada lily, and Indian pinks would all be attractive in that kind of a garden. If you want to do plant combinations, you can use the familiar combination formula of thriller, spiller, and filler, having tall plants that are going to be very striking, a filler plant to fill in the main body, and then a spiller plant to create interest over the edge of the pot. You could have seasonal plant combinations. Here's a Mount Cuba example of some plants that were attractive in the spring. If you want to have multi-seasonal combinations, this would be a nice example for shade. Again, you're going to want to prioritize foliage, color, and texture. You could use a tall fern, like an ostrich fern, and different types of alum roots, the heucheras around the base. Some of the smaller sedges could serve as your filler plants, and wild geranium that I mentioned earlier in the perennials section could be a nice plant for the middle, and tall bottlebrush grass could be a thriller plant. Here's some examples from Mount Cuba for part shade. You've got either the white or the pink turtle head as your tall plant, ferns pouring over the side, and alum root in the middle. By the way, marginal wood fern, the example I give here is an evergreen. Another lovely example would be columbine as your thriller plant, heuchera for the filler, and then wild stonecrop as the spiller plant. It's blooming beautifully right now, but it will continue to look attractive even once the flowers have left. Here's the example with bottlebrush grass in the center, lobelia as your filler, and blue mist flower. And I've indicated you should have copies in the handouts that actually show pictures, and I give you the species names, and you can see what seasons these will help when they'll be flowering. Another nice example with coneflower, the penstemon that we've talked about several times, and I don't think I included the particular cultivar, but it's the snow flurry cultivar, which actually is a recumbent cultivar that would be attractive as the spiller in this particular pot combination. Another great one for sun with tall blazing star, smooth blue aster, and moss phlox as your spiller. A grass that I haven't mentioned, Punicum virgatum, switchgrass, has really beautiful open, airy flower heads, and it will be attractive for a long season. Again, the short heath aster and really attractive goldenrod. This is the one I spoke about earlier, Solidago cassia. And if you wanted to have a wetland planter, you could use our native hibiscus, either the red or the white, rushes, which can live in standing water, as your spiller, and this iris as the filler. And I think I've given the tips on assembling containers. It's pretty much the way you would do containers for any type of plant. You want to allow space for growth, make sure that the roots are covered, but the base of the plant is not covered, and allow a bit of room at the top so that you can water the plants. You'll want to, when you first put them together, you'll want to water them thoroughly and use mulch, both to retain soil moisture and give it a finished look. Clay feet will allow you to have better drainage. And if you have very large pots, you might consider using a plant dolly to help you move them around and rotate them. It's a good idea to place the pots where the roots can remain as cool as possible while the leaves receive sun. And Mount Cuba advises to place them in a location just slightly cooler than they would grow in natural circumstances. You'll want to water them regularly and feed the soil with your compost, watering as much as possible at the base of the plants. And then just watch out for them over the winter. Try to use frost-proof pots if you're going to keep them outside. You can either surround them with leaves or blankets and try to heel them in. And you don't want to overwater those plants. Let's see, do we want to take a few more questions here before I do the last portion, Leslie? Because I know we're getting close to finishing time.
Yep. So we did just have one question about how do you overwinter perennials. So I think you probably just covered some of those tips. Somebody had asked if you have potting soil, they've seen potting soil for end ground use. Is there a concern about using that for containers?
I'm not familiar with that, but if it says, well, it's described as a potting soil.
Yeah, but it's supposed to be in ground use.
I think when Mount Cuba gave the advice about not using soil from your garden, I think if it's a bagged soil, it would serve as well, no matter what how it's described. I think it would do okay.
And what do you mean when you say heal in something?
That's when you're actually, if you do have space out ground, you're space with ground, you're actually digging down a little bit and allowing a container to be either a plant, if you're healing a plant in, or a container to be partially surrounded by soil, because the soil will retain a little bit more of the heat.
Okay. We had a question about delay of spring cleanup. If you're recommending that people delay their spring cleanup, is there a particular time that's best to do that? And when you do eventually cut things back, how far do you cut stems back?
Okay, good question. One of the sources that I looked to, again in preparation, was actually asking people to modify their standards, to actually advocate a slightly messier look. This isn't allowing things to go completely wild, but just understand that your garden is not just going to be beautiful, but it's creating a habitat. And so not to be so concerned about the perfection of getting everything tucked underground in the winter. That particular speaker in her blog talked about waiting till the weather had warmed up. So she was saying about 50 or 60 degrees, if you can possibly bear to wait that long. Now, Sam Droege, who is a specialist, very knowledgeable on bees, actually suggested, if people possibly can, to retain about a foot or 15 inches of the stems, and to actually let those stems linger, and then the new growth come up around it, because it's the following year that those insects will be using the hollow stems.
Oh, okay. So that you're actually keeping those throughout the year.
Yeah, if you can possibly put up with that look. I'm getting used to it myself, and sometimes having those stems makes it a little hard to work in my garden. I've sometimes stumbled and broken off the stems, but I'm allowing, for example, I have a shorter Joe Pye, and I have the stems cut off from last season, and I'm allowing the new growth to come up around that, and that will camouflage those stems.
Okay. And we did have a question previously about aphids on milkweed, and they said the aphids were really taking over. Do you have any ideas about how to control aphids? They were pulling them off and pinching them, but the plant was almost so overrun, and they didn't want to hurt the eggs and larvae.
Okay. I guess I haven't had to deal with the aphids, so I don't have really good suggestions. I know sometimes people talk about using a gentle spray of water, but again, if you're worried about, I think the eggs would tend to be on the undersides of the leaves. So if you could gently spray or pinch from the upper surface, I think you'd be okay.
Okay. All right, why don't we finish up and we'll take final questions at the end.
Okay, I've got a couple sources that you might look to learn more. One would be from our website, Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, mgnv.org, and I think I list this at the end of the handout. The section that I'd have you particularly look at is this one here. It's in the menu. You look for tried and true native plants for the Mid-Atlantic. There'll be a pull down menu that will be broken down into trees, shrubs, and other types of plants. When you select one of those categories, for example, I've shown shrubs here, you'll get a whole list of desirable native plants. You can click on one of these links, and you'll actually get a very detailed fact sheet that provides lots of information, some photos to remind you what the plant looks like, lots of details about its height and bloom color, and then growing and maintenance tips. Our website also has weekly articles about all different aspects of gardening and different issues like control of mosquitoes that I mentioned earlier. Another great site is the Going Native site from North Carolina State, which is particularly focused on landscaping for wildlife with native plants. You can look to this website for the National Wildlife Federation. Doug Tellamy has been collaborating with them, and you can enter your specific zip code and get a listing of plants that will attract particular Lepidoptera. A really excellent publication is this one from Virginia Tech. It was a prize-winning publication created by Mary Free, one of our Arlington Alexandria Master Gardeners, and she is actually working on a more active online version that will probably include some of her lovely videos as well. There's Missouri Botanical Garden is just an excellent resource in general, but it has a specific section on container gardening with native plants that you might want to look at. If you want to check out where you can see native plants, our Master Gardener demonstration gardens are a good place to start. This particular photo was taken at Glen Carlin, where we have dedicated monarch beds and pollinator beds, and we've received certification from both National Wildlife Federation and the Audubon at Home program. Other places to look would be Meadowlark Gardens, U.S. National Arboretum, both the meadow area, and if you want to see woodland species, Fern Valley. The outside area at U.S. Botanic Garden, the so-called regional garden section of the National Garden, will show you how you can use native plants in a landscape setting. And also the Nature Conservancy has a small garden behind their headquarters in Arlington. If you want to know where to buy native plants, please go to the Plant Nova Natives website. They have lots of great information there about plants, but one section you can look at is this section where you can see where natives are sold all year round. I've purchased from all of these reputable nurseries, and they will also list seasonal plant sales. I want to mention, I've mentioned Sam Droge's name several times, D-R-O-E-G-E. Please look for his website, which has fabulous macro photographs of bees. And I've also mentioned our Arlington County naturalist, Alonso Abogadas. Please check out his Capital Naturalist blogs and Facebook page to learn a lot more about native plants. Since I created the resources list of the handouts, I found some other really good books, and I can include descriptions of those books in another email message that I can send out to all of today's participants. Any more questions, Leslie?
Okay, we did have a previous question that was talking about, are there any perennials that you recommend that do particularly well in shade, like pretty severe shade?
Okay, in my garden, one of those early spring plants that I mentioned, the wild geranium maculatum, does well in shade. That tall, attractive bottlebrush grass does well in shade. I haven't mentioned these species, but wild ginger is a great ground cover. It has a lovely purple flower that's underneath the leaves that's pollinated by beetles. Foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia, it's flowering now with gorgeous flower spikes. That's really attractive. Some of the other woodland woodland wildflowers, like the Mertensia, the bluebells, Indian pinks grow in semi-shade conditions. The woodland sunflower grows at the edges of woods. So those would be some. And if you look under the tried and true perennials, you can see very specific information about the growing conditions.
Okay.
Those are some of my favorites.
Sure. Thank you. We had a question about wild ginger, and they were wondering if they've had a hard time finding it at nurseries. I know at our Glen Carlin plant sales, we've sold that in the past. So that's one place that they can look for that.
Yes. Unfortunately, Glen Carlin's spring plant sale was had to be canceled this year, and Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia always have a booth at the annual Green Spring plant sale, which again was canceled. I understand that has been rescheduled tentatively for October. We hope that the health conditions will allow. Wild ginger is a very popular plant, and it does tend to sell out quickly at those sales. But I've been able to get it from all of the other nurseries that are mentioned. Locally, Nature by Design and Earth Sangha have had it. Hill House and Watermark Woods are a little more remote, but the other two are total native plant nurseries that are right in our area. Nature by Design is in Alexandria, Earth Sangha is in Springfield, and they both are open and functioning and have COVID-19 precautions in effect.
Great, thank you. Elaine, you're getting a flood of compliments on the chat, so I just want to share that with you. We've had people from Ohio, Connecticut, of course, all of our local areas. We had over 160 participants today. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and we thank everybody for joining us today, and hope that you will join us next Friday. Next Friday, we are going to be doing foraging for wild edibles, same time. So please register on mgnv.org. Thanks again, Elaine, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.